Welcome to the 16th edition of Jaipur Literature Festival, produced by Dettol Banega Swasth India at the Darbar Hall. We are delighted to introduce the Peasant question with Maryam Aslany, Surinder S, Jodhka in conversation with Mukulika Banerjee. In her much anticipated forthcoming book, Peasants, Maryam Aslany argues that the biggest story of the 21st century is the crisis of the global countryside. In this session, she joins agriculture experts Surinder S, Jodhka and Mukulika Banerjee to discuss the world's largest constituency, the 2 billion peasants who produce 1/3 of the global food supply. Expect to have all your basic assumptions about ecology, progress, and the future debunked. Let's welcome Maryam Aslany. Maryam Aslany, a leading scholar on rural economy and society in the developing world, is a research scholar at African Studies Center, University of Oxford. Her next book, Peasants, will place the peasantry at the center of the global story and offer a radically new account of 21st century capitalism. Surinder S. Jodhka is a professor of sociology at the Jawaharlal Nehru University and fellow at the Center de Sciences Humaines, New Delhi. He has published extensively, including Caste in Contemporary India, and co-edited a work entitled Mapping the Elite, Power, Privilege, and Inequality. Mukulika Banerjee is a professor at LSE and was the inaugural director of the LSE South Asia Center from 2015 to 2020. She has published extensively on Indian democracy, and her latest book, Cultivating Democracy, Politics and Citizenship in Agrarian India, was published by Oxford University Press, New York in 2021. Over to our panelists.
Thank you so much. A warm welcome to you all, and a really special welcome because I know we have some competing panels on at the same time. So we are delighted that you feel committed to this really quite important discussion around farmers, peasants, agricultural workers, we'll talk about these different terms. Now, we had a discussion amongst ourselves yesterday about how to run this and what kind of things we should cover. We have Sainath in the audience who has done so much to increase our understanding and deepen our understanding of rural India. And we're trying to speak to different levels of interest. And we thought we really probably should spend some time thinking about the rural and the word peasant, and what the connotations of that. It's the title of Maryam's new book, which is forthcoming book. And we wanted to talk about why and what the connotations of the word peasant are. Why is it a pejorative term, really, in many ways? And it may be worth just reminding all of us before we launch into this discussion that so much of our perception of peasants or farmers is guided by modernization thesis, where after the Second World War, really the academic writing, policy worlds imagined the world divided up into the developed world, the developing world, and the underdeveloped world. And the developing world and the underdeveloped world were expected to become like the developed world. There was no other imagination of economies, of labor, of work, of our relationship to the natural environment. It was all guided by what the so-called first world or the developed world were about. And so farmers and rural areas in each of these contexts were expected to become the kind of spaces that the developed world had created. So the urbanization thesis was very important. In this, my predecessor at very illustrious economics professor at LSE, Arthur Lewis, coined this very important paper. I was just talking to Meghna Desai, who is also at the festival. He was saying when the paper came out how important it was in 1954, because Lewis gave his name through this paper to what's called the Lewis turning point. And the official definition of the Lewis turning point is that it's a situation in economic development where surplus rural labor is fully absorbed into the manufacturing sector. This typically causes agricultural and unskilled industrial real wages to rise. So this term is named after Arthur Lewis. So the assumption here is that people don't want to farm, given a choice. They would rather move to manufacturing jobs, and they would rather urbanize rather than remain in rural. Now, I'm going to call on, I wanted us to keep that in mind as we proceed forward. So I'm going to start by asking Maryam to talk about her book a little bit, so you get a sense of what she plans to write. It covers 5 different sites across the world. Why she chose the word peasant, maybe start with that, and then tell us a little bit about the different sites. And then I'm going to invite Surinder to do the same, because he has a forthcoming book called The Changing Face of Village India, and Surinder has been editing various reviews of rural affairs for many years. So I'm going to invite them both to just tell us a little bit about their forthcoming work, and then we'll pick out some themes and talk about them in greater detail. Maryam.
Thank you, Mukulika. Thank you. Sorry.
It's on. Just hold it really close.
Okay. Does it work? All right. Thank you so much for being here. It's a privilege to be talking about my book for the very first time at JLF Jaipur. And I made some notes so I don't forget my words. I hope you don't mind. So my book, which I haven't written, I'm actually starting. Okay, sorry. I've just started writing it, so it's not finished. It still has another 3 years to go. So it's quite nerve-wracking to speak about something I haven't even written about, but I give it my best. So Peasants tells the story of the world through 5 crops: rice, sugarcane, cocoa, oil palm, and coca. Apart from oil palm, all these crops are produced by small farmers. And this year, I'm actually going to spend much of my time traveling in villages in Latin America, Asia, and West Africa to collect the stories from the farmers and try to put a portrait of the global countryside together. And the reason I'm writing this book, because I'm frustrated with the ways in which we talk about the world. I think the story of the world is being told through the urban perspective. Our policymakers and journalists are mainly concerned with the urban crisis. And as a result, they overlook half of humanity that lives still in the countryside. And even the word peasant has pretty much disappeared from the Western vocabulary. But the disappearance of the word doesn't mean the disappearance of the thing. Even people who talk about it, they don't really know who they're talking about. I had a discussion with a gentleman yesterday who asked me, what are you writing about? I said, I'm writing about peasants. He said, what do you mean? I said, I'm writing about peasant. And he said, do you mean working classes or the poor people? And so that conception, I mean, is that peasants are just as primitive and poor. It was quite striking. So I'm trying to correct that. And with this book, I hope to put the peasant at the center of the global story. The reason I picked up this title, because it's a negative word, it makes people embarrassed and uncomfortable. In many languages, it's used as an expression of anger and abuse. Even my academic colleagues at Oxford, when they hear the title, they raise eyebrows. Few of them have told me, peasants don't exist anymore. Some have said to me, you cannot say that word. I mean, there is something kind of taboo about it. And I wonder why that is. Why is that this word creates such a negative reaction in people, especially in West, when they hear it? And I'd be interested to know what my co-panelists have to say about this. My own assumption is that it is a residue of the massive psychodrama that has made us who we are. We can call it modernization. I think we have tried to make ourselves modern by killing the peasant inside us or by expelling the peasant out of us. But I think that expulsion was never complete. And that is why the mention of the word peasant takes us to a very unresolved and uncomfortable part of our psyche. And I think to understand the global countryside, we need to confront our persona and we need to embrace the peasant within. And this is exactly why I've chosen the title, to confront that discomfort. Leave it there.
Thank you very much, Maryam and Mukulika and GLF for asking us to speak on this topic. And we are competing with major celebrities. And thank you very much. So many of you are here. So that means we still have kind of, enough mass to talk about. Yeah, okay. So I think the point that Mukulika started with and the way Maryam has been kind of articulating her own anxiety in the Western world when we use the word peasant, it's not merely a matter of academic debates. I mean, modernization thesis was debated in universities, in development studies, and largely rejected. But it continues to be part of, in some sense, our own identities. We are all, in some sense, middle class Indians or not Indians, but we are all educated, we are all sitting here. This is an urban middle class space, this is a global space. So how do we, in some sense, bother about the agrarian world? And I think that's where the question of modernization is not simply a matter of academic debates, but it is also primarily a political question. A political question, the moment it was articulated, was also a political question because this was to tell the world that rest of the world has to be like us. I was here in the previous session where they were talking about the kind of riches India had, and the Britain in 16th, 15th, 16th, 17th century was such a poor country. But we are made to believe otherwise, that it is the world of civilization, is the land of civilization. And in that sense, the point that she's talking about, how peasants get then categorized as backward, as something which is left behind. And in the post-Second World world, when development studies picked up, where peasant societies were not seen as Western societies. None of the European societies were characterized as peasant societies, and that's the time when word peasant becomes popular. And when we talk about the agrarian world today, again, I think those problems continue, which have in some sense become part of the middle class common sense, the dominant common sense with which we all grow, through which we also identify ourselves, through which we also see rest of the world. We have seen farmers' movement 2 years back here on the outskirts of Delhi, and perhaps also closer to Jaipur and the whole of northwest India, the whole country in some sense. And the middle class reactions were very interesting. And also it showed how the agrarian worlds have not gone away. They could come and actually occupy your lands. And these are not quote-unquote backward people. These are not people who don't understand how the world is functioning. Their articulation, and many of us, you would have heard those videos, farmers speaking, their articulations were, academically speaking, among the most intelligent and competent articulation of our times, of the context in which those two farm laws were passed. So I think when we think about agrarian worlds, how do we take them out of this modernization thesis, which is very, very critical? The moment we accept modernization thesis, there's nothing left of peasant. Peasant is only a kind of, hangover of the past, and it is actually then becomes burden of the middle class to get them out of it. That's why these farm laws were seen as being good for farmers. Doesn't matter, because they don't know what is good for them. So this narrative is also hegemonic. This narrative, in some sense, normalizes the hegemonic position of the urban middle classes, which include people like us. So I think it is a much bigger question. It's a bigger question both at the global level, because there is a connection between first world and third world, but there's also a bigger question in relation to our own relationship with the rurals, with the agrarian worlds. And I think at some level we should also raise question of caste. When we come to India or Indian ruralities and agrarian worlds, we don't have peasants in India in that sense, the sense in which Europe had peasants. When Marx is talking about peasantry, he's talking about rural demographics as demographics of peasants. While in India we had agriculture, we had agrarian lives, and we continue to have largest number of people who depend on agriculture. Many of them also do other things because they can't survive just by doing cultivation. So very small proportion of people cultivate land and survive on agriculture, but they need to be also engaged with empirically, and their relational contexts and relational structures in some sense are very, very different, and they have been diverse relational structures. They have been changing over time. So the problem with these kinds of modernization theses, which are kind of, overgeneralization of also not only human history, but of human futures. And I think that's where this kind of topic becomes very, very critical, and many of us have been engaging with these. Thank you very much. I think we will move on to the next question.
Thank you very much, Surinder, for that spirited defense. I think in this first round of contributions, we have established that none of us are really buying the modernization thesis. So I think it is important to recognize the inherent bias in that kind of view of human development. It's a teleology that simply does not work in a place like India, where I think we can spend a little bit of time. Maryam worked with sugarcane growers in Maharashtra. Surinder has been working in Punjab and Haryana for decades. I have over 20 years worked in West Bengal. So let me, for this bit, I think, again, we've got to remember that in post-independence India, the village was seen in a very particular way, and there was remarkable consensus around a group of people versus a second camp. So you can call it the sort of Ambedkar view of the village versus the Gandhi view of the village, where Ambedkar, Nehru, and others, absolutely seminal to the formation of independent India, were in disagreement on many issues, but I think their agreement on rural India being an unreliable place for locating power was fairly certain. Power had to be centralized at the national level. Information and ideas had to flow from the center to the local, from the urban to the rural. The rural famously was described as a place of prejudice and vice, right? And this perception of rural India that Surinder was pushing back against, to a large extent, comes from that kind of construction of the political imagination. Now, pushing back against it, what I've done in Cultivating Democracy, my new book, is used cultivation both as practice of agriculture, but also as a metaphor to say that something like democracy, you cannot just import some institutions and set up some bodies and expect democracy to flourish. It has to be very carefully nurtured, protected. It needs vigilance, it needs care, and it needs constant attention. And no one understands this practice better than a farmer. Right? Cultivation is something that agrarian and rural India, not the same thing, understands, even when people are running small and medium businesses because because agriculture itself doesn't give you enough income. The process of what it is to nurture a crop is something that people understand. So the idea of nurturing institutions is very, very well understood, much better than in urban India. And therefore, I would argue that actually, if you look at village life, it provides what I call the social imaginaries, the way to do these things through social institutions, which are nothing to do with politics, but it tells people how to behave in order to cultivate democratic cultures. The best example of this we found was with as Surinder mentioned, the farmers' movement, which the farmers' protests in 2021, when they camped outside Delhi for over a year, through the 4 bitter seasons of a North Indian calendar year, was really proof of what it means. When journalists landed up and talked to the farmers and said, aren't you cold, aren't you hot, aren't you wet? And they said, yes, we are. But, we're fighting for such a big cause. We're not budging from here till those laws are taken back. And there was a certain determination and a commitment, I think the word commitment, to protecting your political objectives was so clearly articulated in those. And in a weird way, we think of, and I'm going to stop and here, allow other two to talk about their experiences. We mentioned caste, and yet we somehow imagine, the moment you say village, you say caste. And when did the village recently come into our national imagination in India? When lockdown was introduced at 4 hours notice. Do you remember? And all those migrant workers who had left rural India, had come to urban India, had to walk back. And people were like, why are they going back? There's nothing in the village. And when they were asked this, they said, in a village, you don't die alone like a dog. You would in a city because nobody cares. So at that point, the urban discourse about the village was, it's all full of caste, as if there is no caste in urban India, where there are neighborhoods where, even in a city like Chennai, there are neighborhoods where only Brahmins live, and so on. So there's plenty of caste in urban India, but we think somehow this is associated with rural India. But yet there are moments even in rural life, as anthropologists like us have, all three of us are anthropologists, sociologists, show this, when you create, rural life creates genuine, what Ambedkar would call fraternity. When you're able to create solidarities, not on the basis of pre-existing identities, but through a common cause. And this is what was created at Singhu border and all the other protest sites around Delhi. If you looked at the culture of that republic of protest, as I called it, you see that an extraordinary kind of leveling and horizontal solidarities were produced. So really the single point takeaway from that I would like you to take away from what I'm saying here is that we don't expect rural India or rural life anywhere to be the producer of intellectual ideas. We always expect it to receive ideas from somewhere else, whereas those of us who spent some time working and understanding rural life would argue for exactly the opposite. So, Maryam, would you like to talk about your Maharashtra work that you did for your DPhil?
Before I get there, Mukulika, if you don't mind, we talked about modernization theory, and sorry about that. Yes, I just wanted to expand on that before I get to Maharashtra, and also talk about 4 misconceptions we have about rural life and about peasantry, what I call in my book the myths. So, and I'm hoping, and this is what this lecture promised, to debunk these myths about peasantry. One, you both mentioned very articulately about modernization, and most of you, some of you may remember the finance minister of India during the Manmohan Singh government said, I'm going to quote him, that my vision of a poverty and modern India will be an India where a vast majority, something like 85% of its population, eventually live in cities. So at the time, 70% of people resided in countryside. Today, that number is 65. And of course, he was just repeating the thoughts of the urban or kind of the modern thinkers. And I think left and right are both guilty of washing peasant out of history. Because they thought peasant stands in the way of progress and modernization. Even Karl Marx, who we all know as a very sympathetic person, he wasn't very nice to peasant. As you know, he called them a sack of potatoes, and also taught socialism could never thrive as long as we allow peasant farming to continue. And so basically peasant became the embodiment of everything that Western society was running away from. Dirty, primitive, inefficient, stupid, and stubbornly unchanging. So that's the first myth, the modernization theory. The second is that we all think that because now we have larger scale farming, we do not need peasant farming anymore because of the economy of scale. So we have larger scale farming, we have machinery, we have industrialization. So why should we need the small farmers? It's actually wrong, because even now, in the peak of industrialization, that hasn't happened. We still have, I would argue that peasant agriculture has thrived and is going side by side together with industrial farming. And some crops like wheat could be cultivated on big farms, but things like rice, they're very labor intensive and water intensive, and it really needs human care. So, and rice farming employs around 500 million peasant farmers today. And also, like some corporation, actually, we might be surprised that they like to deal with the small farmers, like in chocolate industry, cocaine, and even silk. The corporation likes to deal with the small farmers. Why is that? Because that way they can keep them weak. They can pass on to them the environmental degradation, and they can make the price variation the responsibility of the peasant. So this way, we have a continuation in the peasant farming. The third myth is urbanization. Another big word, we hear it every day, urbanization, 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 and city people think that, or even policymakers think that we all want to be city dwellers, or everybody wants to be city dwellers. The UN predicts that in year 2050, we will have 10 billion people residing on planet Earth, out of which the UN predicts that 7 billion would live in the cities. I mean, can you imagine cities having something around 50 million people living in them? I mean, that's not sustainable. And so there are limits to urbanization. And unless we have exceptional level of industrialization, which I personally doubt, nothing can sustain large population as the land can. And we have, for example, massive migration from Latin America, making their way to the United States. In Africa, we have massive migration. And that's because when we have environmental degradation and some people actually are forced to go and live in the cities, they find themselves in a precarious economy of the city or end up in slum areas. So that urbanization thesis is also a myth. And the fourth myth is that, as Mukulika mentioned, that peasants are desperate. They have this burning desire to leave the land and go and live in the cities. Well, of course, some farmers might dream of a city life, and some might be forced to leave the land. But I found that during my own research and travel, that is not the case with majority of people. And there is enormous loyalty to the land. And because land not only represents livelihood, it also represents ancestors, heritage, and the future. And they do not want to leave it. And I was just talking to a sugarcane farmer in Maharashtra in December, and he was complaining to me that, well, I spent 1 year growing this sugarcane, and then the middleman comes and then takes half my profit. I actually make no money. I'm running this transport business. I sell milk, and just I have enough money to actually pay for the farming. And I thought, well, why would you do it? I mean, why would you go and work outside and just bring the money to farm your land? And he said, well, land needs to be cultivated. I cannot leave it like that, because if I leave the land like that, it will be grabbed by developers, or it will become a barren land, and I have the responsibility to buy the land. And I said, well, why don't you just sell the land and just be done with it, and there is no longer your responsibility? Well, of course, it was a very stupid question from me, but I also wanted to provoke him. And he said, do you sell your mother? And I said, no, what do you mean? He said, land is my mother, and the fertility, what Mukulika mentioned. Well, land is my mother. I do not like to sell my mother. And another farmer told me that when everything else falls apart, I have my little land to stand on. And that feeling of security is very important. I think for the urban middle classes like ours, I mean, we sometimes feel that insecurity in an urban economy, you know, I mean, because we have I mean, I don't have any land, so I'm like, okay, that if things like fall apart, that would have been a nice security. And these four myths have culminated and then became one big fairy tale. And what is that fairy tale? That the peasantry is dead. And so we hear peasants have died, are dying, are going to die, and this is what we've been told. And I'm just going to quote you the historian Eric Hobsbawm, who predicted the most dramatic and far-reaching social change of the second half of the 20th century, and the one which cuts off forever from the past is the death of peasantry. Well, this fairy tale, I argue, never happened, and there are today more peasants than at any point in history. And 250 years from the Industrial Revolution, small farmers still constitute 1/4 of the human species. They produce 1/3 of all food, and the family of peasant farm constitute a large part of 600 million peasant farm on the planet. Even in our 21st century global society, the peasant is the biggest constituency of all. And, okay, I put Maharashtra in it, so I hope that's okay.
I think Surinder can give us a sense also of maybe Maharashtra, but how varied India is. You know, that it's a collection of countries rather than a single one. So different rural context, please.
Yeah. In some sense, continuing with the question Mukulika raised and the kind of points that Maryam was making, the popular views of facts about our world, which are complete myths. And I think biggest myth is what I call as the demographic myth. To begin with, rural and urban are not binary categories. I mean, there's nothing called a village as isolated village. It has never been. It's not like in 17th century or in 5th century villages were isolated. That was not the case. Agriculture has always been a global enterprise. Agriculture can never be done in isolation. It's precisely when agriculture emerges that you have possibilities of cities. The emergence of urban elite, state formation is closely connected with settled agriculture. So I think we need to reimagine the very idea of rural and the very idea of agriculture. Second point, we all think that, rural populations are declining everywhere in the world. Look at the global demographics, and I was actually looking at numbers. It was only recently as 2017 or 2019, that the urban population, the way it is enumerated, is larger than the rural population. But the absolute size of the rural population, globally speaking, not in India, globally speaking, was something like 4 times of what it was at the beginning of 19th century or 20th century. So rural population, absolute size of rural population is still rising. So it's not in any way declining. In case of India, in last 100 years, rural population has grown up by 5 times. Grown up, not declined. Relatively, yes, cities have grown up faster, but that doesn't mean that, and you can't wish away absolute numbers. Absolute numbers are absolute votes. Absolute numbers are hungry people. Absolute numbers are people who are unemployed. So how do you engage with those empirics? And the second point I think is very, very critical, that when we think about rural and urban or peasant and middle class, we tend to binarize that there is one set of people and there are other set of people. We are modern, they are traditional. I think this is biggest tragedy. And this creates not only myths, it also gives a good feeling to us that we know everything which is good for them, and we will tell them how to get out of their kind of left behind presence. So we need to think of differentiated rurals. There are different kinds of rurals. Bengal rural is very different from Maharashtra's rural. Punjab rural is very different from Balochistan's rural. And I think globally we need to recognize that there's nothing called the peasant. I think that's very, very critical, because agrarian lives are lived very differently. The large farms are also realities of agrarian lives, and large farms also produce certain kind of economies and certain kinds of networks and certain kind of global trade systems, and questions of sustainability, very, very critical. How small farmers are able to sustain. These are empirical questions that we need to engage with, but they're also simultaneously political questions. And it is here that we also need to talk about question of gender. When we talk about differentiated rurals, caste we have already talked about. Everyone in the village is not a peasant. And as Sainath has repeatedly shown, the actual number of people who are full-time cultivators is as low as around 10%. I mean, who would think in Punjab that only 10% are full-time cultivators in Punjab, right? And these are ridiculous kind of myths that we have promoted, that anyone who lives in the village, and 55% of India depends on agriculture. We depend on agriculture, but everyone is not a full-time cultivator. So agrarian lives are far more complex. And just because we don't engage with them empirically, that we get kind of then carried away by these myths which are suitable to us. And so my final point in this kind of segment is, then we can perhaps go to discussion, is that how do we, in some sense, move away from these simple binaries, which in some sense are produced by modernization theory, but also by the Orientalist and colonial imaginations of the world, which came to be the hegemonic imaginations of the world through development theory, and they were accepted by the new elite of post-colonial states, including Indian political elite of all categories. I completely agree with her, left to right, everyone in some sense began to see progress as inevitable and progress as desirable and progress is something to pursue. And that notion of progress was to, at some level, kill the peasant and move to city and become industrial and urban middle class, which in some sense, at some level, is very aspirational today for everyone. If you go and ask a young kid in Haryana, they would say, yes, I want to become an officer, I want to become a doctor, I want to become an engineer. But that itself is a part of the same urban hegemony, which is kind of, in some sense, been successful normative. But on ground, those possibilities don't exist. You don't have jobs. And the jobs are also, in some sense, given on the basis of kind of networks that you have, the kind of resources that you have, and where certain people get left behind. That's why you have discontent among Marathas, discontent among Jats, discontent among Patels, discontent among various kinds of agrarian communities which have not been able to urbanize themselves. And these are resourceful people. These are not people who are poor. These are not people who don't have resources to get educated. So I think we need to historicize the question of agriculture. We have this narrative of agrarian crisis, which again kind of makes us pity the rural. It makes us pity these farmers. They are stupid people. They end up overspending, and then they get into debt trap, and then they end up killing themselves. So I think that narrative of crisis also at some level takes away the processes through which agriculture becomes a difficult life. And that process needs to be empirically engaged with. And they are varied processes. Sugarcane farmers have different kind of crises. Paddy farmers have different kind of crises. And so-called big farmers of Punjab also have different kinds of crises.
Lovely. Thank you, Surinder. Thank you, Maryam. We have about 10 to 12 minutes for a few questions, if anyone has them. Our panelists have, gosh, okay, lots of questions. So, white jacket, fourth row. And if you can keep your questions brief, please.
Thank you for this excellent panel. Three of you did a good job. I'm looking forward to Maryam and Surinder's work. I was thinking about the category of peasant. And can peasant be exploitative? And can peasant be someone who can invoke violence in the face of social relations that operate in a setup that a peasant is working? Because the stereotype understanding of a peasant generally is the subaltern, somebody who is working the field. But in the relations that we have that work in rural, at least in this part of the world, is the character of a peasant really gets further hierarchicized. There are hierarchies within. And the term farmer is such a misnomer. It's a very bad term to represent the rural setup that we have.
What's the misnomer?
Farmer.
Farmer.
Because what we have is farmers and then slaves of farmers who are bonded to them for several generations. And then they become the petty imagination. So what we have is a very post-colonial understanding of a peasantry that we see today. And so the question remains, can we further democratize the understanding of how peasant is formed and found? And by the way, Ambedkar was somebody who pushed back on, he said farmer and agricultural worker, somebody we need to really distinguish. Farmer gets recognition, because they have land. Land is essential. And I want to piggyback on Surinder's point, the penultimate point he was making about this categorization. So could we then probe, because the farmers' protest we had on the outskirts of Delhi was a very missed call. It could have also demanded for the redistribution of the land, another important cultivating resources that exist. But it really privileged the dominant, even though marginal farmers, but land is a big currency in today's rural India.
Thank you. Okay, shall we take one more question from the second row lady here? Can she have a microphone, please?
Thank you.
Surinder will take it. Yeah.
Actually, as part of my work, I have been observing that number of Indian states are preferring and even supporting private companies to settle, to start the renewable projects. And they are preferring agricultural lands for that in state of Karnataka, Andhra, Maharashtra. So, though we ensure that they are willing sellers, but it still bothers me because you are taking their land. Even if they are not selling 100% parcel of their land, because they say, of course, as Maria mentioned, that it's their mother, land is their mother, they cannot sell all of their land, but still you are taking a part of it. So how do you see it as it's right as their renewable policy to settle up, to achieve India's renewable target, but they are preferring agricultural lands for setting up the farms?
We'll take one more question.
Thank you.
So there's a gentleman here, fifth row. And then we'll give you all of them.
So this is going to be, I'm probably going to garner a lot of hate for it, but this is an alternative perspective, and I think since we're celebrating ideas, this would be great. So as a technologist, I'd like to know, with the introduction of artificial intelligence and all these modern day technologies, and the hegemony that is in technology, such as Bill Gates buying 2/3 of the agricultural land in the United States, probably going to implement these modern day technologies. Does the peasant have a future?
Thank you. My panelists say we should take more questions. You have a question, really? Okay. So I'll take, there's a question at the back, since you're right there with the microphone. But can you keep them really brief, because then it allows our panelists to answer.
Hello, sir. Good morning to all. My question is regarding Surinder sir's point that there are people within the system, like the farming families, who have the resourceful persons. And at the same time, where we are taking, you have accepted about that we are not taking the modernization theories of the people, because as in India, we have been doing this work. As myself, I come from a farming family in the Western Rajasthan district, where the water levels are depleting, where we want a life which are better for us, which are better for the families. So what kind of alternatives which are being given to the farmers who do not want to go into the state where they want to lead a good life?
Thank you. Thank you. There were some questions here. There's one in the front row. Yeah.
I work in Maharashtra, where farmers have committed suicide. And through all my travels and work, I find that many of the widows are women farmers, but not recognized in our society.
Yeah.
And not only in Maharashtra, but in other states as well. And I think all research seems to look at male farmers, and women farmers are completely unrecognized.
Exactly. I mean, Maryam's work doesn't. And in fact, if you look at it, most of us, when we do our writing, we actually point out the typical farmer in India now is female. So we all take note of that. Willie.
Just a final point. I'm feeling very conscious that we haven't done anything for this in the festival. Maryam, do you want to just say for 1 second, a major issue this year that we haven't addressed, your T-shirt? Woman, life, freedom. What's that about?
Okay, so talk about that and take any of the questions that you can, and Surinder will answer the rest of them.
Okay, thank you, William, for asking that. So I don't know how many of you are aware, I'm sure all of you are. We have the first woman-led revolution in Iran currently, and woman life freedom is or Zan Zandagi Azadi in Farsi is the main slogan of this movement. And we've been fighting against the autocratic state for the last 4 months. and hoping to bring them down and bring integrity and freedom for the people of Iran. So that was my 1 minute speech.
Thank you. Maryam, I wonder whether, since there have been questions about sustainability and renewability, if you can say, we haven't talked about climate change at all, since that's such an
Okay.
issue, so do you want to address
Yes, but
those issues?
I just quickly just mention, in my work, I find the base of agriculture is actually on women. When men are just doing other things to bring an extra income for the family, women are the one who are actually running the farm. So you're absolutely right. On farmers versus peasants, farmer is a modern word. I mean, if you read historical work, if you read archival work in English, in French, in German, in Russian, you do not find the word farmer. It's a modern invention. So because we don't have peasant in our vocabulary anymore. And in terms of technology, I think farmers are very, very keen to embrace technology. Some of them are telling me that we are, I mean, they have all these kind of apps and they want a drone so they can kind of have an aerial view of their land. But I'm not very keen on Bill Gates, because what Bill Gates does, and as we know, he funds scholarly work on agriculture, and it's like a vicious circle. So for farmers to produce more, they need fertilizers and this and this and that, and I mean, then they go and produce that. In terms of climate change, yes, I argue that peasants they have moral and ecological vision in a way that urban people do not have, and they mediate our relationship with nature. Because, I mean, we talk about climate change all the time, but our worries are very much urban focused. I mean, for farmers who are being kind of in touch with the land and cultivation, soil degradation, water table is going down, heats, pesticides, and all of that are. Oh, sorry, yes. Yes, absolutely. So we need these people if we want to kind of survive the climate change.
Very briefly, I think I had mentioned two words which I could not elaborate because lack of time. This is in response to the question on caste as well as on gender. When I use the word differentiated rurals means relational structures of agriculture need to be also investigated and studied. We end up with these very essentialist categories which generalize for all the places, for all the times, categories like peasant, or for that matter, even categories like farmer. Agriculture is being done by large variety of people. And some of them cannot be even characterized as farmers or peasants, but they're still doing agriculture in addition to things that they are doing otherwise. I mean, you ask them, what do you do? They may not even identify themselves as cultivators or farmers, but they're doing cultivations, or the other way around. You ask them, what are you doing? I'm a farmer or I'm a peasant, but actually their majority of income might be coming from elsewhere. But it depends on the context. When Ambedkar was talking about cultivators and farm workers and peasants, I think that was a very specific context, and he was also speaking in a very general sense. We need to specify. Caste structures, caste relations also vary significantly. In UP, for example, 12% of Dalits have land. In Punjab, less than 1% of Dalits have land. In some areas, agriculture itself is becoming Dalitized and OBCized because upper dominant castes are moving out of agriculture. And this has happened in Telangana, it is happening in some other regions as well. So I think one needs to constantly connect with rural realities. And that same applies to the question of gender. The feminization of agriculture was being talked about, but there's also defeminization of agriculture. Many places, women are actually moving out of agriculture and it's becoming something else. We have reverse tenancy in Punjab where there are small entrepreneurs who lease in small holdings of land because men are moving out of agriculture and women are not taking over. In some areas, feminization is happening. In some cases, you have women farmers becoming the norm of agriculture, but not everywhere. So I think that's where the point lies, that we don't need to essentialize, or we should not essentialize, because that not only is empirically wrong, it also creates wrong political effects. It creates wrong kind of common sense about ourselves. So we should not distance ourselves from rural realities, and we are located in them. One can say that peasant is within us, but that would be one way of putting it. But we are not detached from it existentially.
Thank you, Surinder.
Mukulika, can I
Quickly.
say, yes.
10 seconds.
Just to follow up and just to finish, I have a quote from Dostoevsky I'd like to share with you, which also takes us back to the title of this talk. The question of the peasant is our most important question, a question on which our whole future rests, but they are still a theory for us, and they still stand before us as a riddle. We, the lover of people, regard them as a part of theory, and it seems not one of us loves them as they really are, but only as each of us imagine them to be. Thank you.
Thank you.
A big round of applause for Maryam, Surinder, and Mukulika Banerjee. Let's empower the peasants, empowering peasants. Thank you so much.